Energy media occasionally deviates from energy and climate journalism when there are, important momentous events going on that benefit from our expert interview format. And in Canada right now, that it certainly fits the bill. We've got it seems like a political crisis on our hands, and I'm going to talk to Professor Duane Bratt from the Mount Royal University. Welcome to the interview, Duane.
Hey, Markham. Nice to be here.
Well, I'm really pleased to have you here because a lot of my viewers are wondering what the heck is going on in Ottawa. We've got CPC leader Aaron O'Toole has been ousted as leader by his caucus. Why don't we start there? Can you explain that for us, please?
Okay, so I've been getting a lot of questions, particularly from Albertans going, how was the CPC caucus able to remove Aaron O'Toole in the span of about 2 days, and yet nobody can remove Jason Kenney? And so to explain this, there's actually federal legislation through the Reform Act that Michael Chong, a conservative who's still in caucus, brought forward. And it means that at the beginning of right after an election, each party caucus has to vote on a number of items about how they want to go about expelling a member, for example, or holding a leader to account. And in this case, the Conservative caucus agreed that if 20% of caucus members signed a public letter, that would force a leadership review amongst the caucus in their very next meeting. So that letter came out on Monday. They had their very first caucus meeting today, and 61% of caucus members voted Aaron O'Toole out. They're now in the process, as we speak, of choosing an interim leader who is then disqualified for running for the leadership, and then they will have a leadership race. So that is what has occurred. Now, it may seem very sudden that Aaron O'Toole was removed, but in fact, he's been a dead man walking since the election. You lose an election right now in Canada at the federal level, and you're one of the major party leaders, you don't get a second opportunity. The days of a John Turner or Stephen Harper getting another kick at the can are gone. Andrew Scheer left, Michael Ignatieff left, Stéphane Dion left, down the line. But when we look at why he was removed, it's not just because he lost an election. Or even lost a winnable election. To many, it was how he lost it. People don't know what Aaron O'Toole stands for. He ran for the leadership of the party back in 2017 as a moderate conservative. In 2020, he ran for the leadership as a blue Tory. Then in the election campaign, he tried to tack to the center. Most notably, and this ties into your regular programming, he brought in and recognized that carbon pricing is real. Now, it was a very convoluted program to try to distinguish it from the Trudeau's plan, but it was it was an honest approach, and it recognized, most importantly, that climate change is real and carbon pricing can contribute to combating that. This was in opposition to much of the members of his own party who did not enthusiastically support that, but they were silent. It was like, all right, let's try this. If O'Toole wins, that's good, we're back in power. If it doesn't work, well, then we'll see what happens. And it didn't work, and you see what happens. And I've heard from numerous conservatives since the election that any future leader has to go back to opposing carbon taxes. And so it's losing, it's the flip-flopping, and the truck convoy over the past week has been a clear illustration of this. A week ago, Aaron O'Toole didn't want to talk about the truck convoy coming to Ottawa, but then Andrew Scheer, the former leader, came out in support of it. Candice Bergen, his deputy leader, came out in support of it. Pierre Poilievre, his finance critic who wants to be the next leader of the party, came out in favor of it. So Aaron O'Toole came out in favor of it. But he said, I'll meet with you people, but not on Parliament Hill and not the organizers. And he put out a video, and none of that looked real. It looked almost like a hostage tape. And so, while it seems very sudden, it's actually been building over a long period of time.
Now, Duane, let's talk about the convoy, the truckers convoy, because that's been generating a lot of interest. I mean, in media and on my social media feeds. And the CPC, many of the CPC members seem to have embraced it. They've supported it. They're showing it in videos and pictures with the convoy members. And as this crisis seems to be intensifying now, we've got the hardcore convoy members still left in the city of Ottawa and don't appear to be going anywhere. How did that play into O'Toole's ouster?
I think O'Toole was going to get forced out regardless, but I think the timing was related to the convoy because he appeared to be out of step with the majority of his caucus who wanted to support the convoy. And then he did support it, but in a sort of half-hearted way that didn't seem authentic. So there's a lack of authenticity that O'Toole has. I think the Conservatives have put a bad gamble on. They have identified, they go, well, these truckers hate Trudeau. We hate Trudeau. Let's work together. Let's support them. There were photos today of the Saskatchewan caucus waving the Saskatchewan flag out by Saskatchewan truckers. This is not going to end well. You've already got the chief of police in Ottawa saying the police can't deal with this, suggesting that this may require a military action, or who knows how long this is going to respond for. And if this ends badly, and I think it will, because you've got a group of bad actors with big trucks, with time on their hands, who are well motivated, they're not going to leave peacefully. And then you've got one of the political parties condemning it. In the Liberals, Justin Trudeau was very strong in his language on Monday, and you've got another political party endorsing it. Now, Canadians may be fed up with COVID. It's been 2 years. They want the restrictions dropped, but do they support this type of lawless activity? This isn't just shutting down Parliament. There are people live in downtown Ottawa. People work downtown Ottawa, and not just political staffers and MPs and bureaucrats, but small business owners. Businesses, restaurants were supposed to open up on Monday. They're not opening up in downtown Ottawa because of this. Schools are not going back in person in downtown Ottawa because it is unsafe. And so let's see how this plays out. But this is not a large protest. You know, we saw 500,000 people protesting in Montreal over climate policy, but it's they're there for the long term, and it shows 100 semi trucks can shut down a city.
Well, okay, Duane, what do you make of the comments from the Ottawa chief of police today that there is significant evidence? He made it sound like concrete. They didn't doubt it, that there was significant American funding and organizational support for the convoy. I mean, basically, it sounded like to me, like the American Trump supporters were, playing a role in that convoy.
I don't think they're part of the convoy, but are they helping to fund it? This has got a lot of media attention in the US. Donald Trump Jr. has endorsed it. Donald Trump Sr. has endorsed it. Tucker Carlson is having it on a daily basis. He dedicated almost an entire show to this. So given that atmosphere, would it shock me? Would it surprise me that there is foreign money flowing into this? Absolutely not. And I'm sure CSIS is looking at these flows very carefully. Do I think there's American actors in there? It's still tough to get across the border. So if they're coming across the border, they better be vaccinated. So I don't think there's Americans participating in this. But do I think there's American money? Absolutely. And that this is worrisome.
Well, let's talk now about Alberta. And of course, there's the blockade. There was a blockade at the Coots border crossing.
So I think this is important. I don't think it's got as much national attention as probably it should have, because it's not in Ottawa, or it's not in downtown Toronto, or for that matter, downtown Calgary. But in many respects, I think this is worse, because they're shutting down the only 24/7 border access between Canada and the United States. This is a lawless activity. There are truckers who are stuck in the convoy, legitimate vaccinated truckers stuck in there. There's also truckers stuck on the Montana side who are Canadian citizens trying to get back into the country. There are going to be impacts on grocery stores, because that's where the produce from California is going to roll in from. It's not coming from the West, it's coming from the South. And it's also in a much more remote place. So if you think about the challenges the Ottawa police have, Coutts is 230 people. The Lethbridge, the largest center, is 45 minutes away. And so they've been playing sort of a cat and mouse game. They have dispersed some of the protesters, and then they go and set up sympathy blockades on other highways outside of Tabor or outside of Lethbridge, for people that know Southern Alberta. It also appears that there is at least back channels of negotiations going on with the provincial government. So let's go back to the Ottawa situation. The government is opposed to the protesters. They called it an illegal act. They're hoping for police action. The police chief doesn't know what to do. But you've got opposition MPs supporting it. In this case, you've got government MPs supporting it. Grant Hunter, who was an ex-cabinet minister, but still a UCP backbencher, was there on the weekend. He brought his grandkids. He wanted to show them that this is what freedom was like. Freedom for who? I don't know. But there's a vaccinated versus unvaccinated battle, and there's a white versus South Asian battle. 20% of the trucking industry is South Asian drivers. They're not the ones protesting. If you go to Ottawa, they'll find one or two South Asian drivers. This is largely white drivers. And so it's the South Asians on the Montana side who can't get in, and the white ones who are doing it. So there's a racial element to that. The other interesting comparison is about 2 years ago, and this brings us back to your climate energy stuff, protests over the Wet'suwet'en coastal GasLink that led to sympathy blockades in parts of Alberta and parts of Ontario and other parts of the country. The Alberta government, the Jason Kenney government, was moved quickly on that. They brought in emergency legislation. They called it Bill 1. It was the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act that increased the criminal penalties for blocking rail lines, highway lines. So how did the government respond to those blockades? Very quickly, very tough. How are they responding with the blockades in Coutts? By announcing today, they plan on getting rid of COVID restrictions within a couple days. Very different response, which is why Native groups in Alberta are just outraged, and they've been putting out statements going, why the kid gloves, why the capitulation on one side, and the demonization and legislation and police action on the other. It's very hypocritical.
Now, Duane, should we be worried about the spread of the kind of political culture that you see in the Ottawa convoy and you see in the Coutts blockade? And the reason I ask this is because there were sympathy demonstrations and convoys in smaller communities across Canada, including my own in Parksville on Vancouver Island last weekend. And is there a danger that this becomes a bit like wildfire and gets out of control?
I think so. I think the Kenney government should have anticipated that there were going to be sympathy rallies in Edmonton and Calgary, because there have been anti-COVID rallies in Edmonton and Calgary pretty much every weekend for 2 years. But I think the Coutts thing completely blindsided them. Jason Kenney left the country. He was in Washington. And here's another interesting aspect. So last Thursday, just before he went to Washington, Kenney held a press conference where he lambasted the trucker vaccine mandate that both Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden have on both sides of the border. And he said he was going to go to Washington. He was going to meet with all the governors. They were going to put pressure on Biden. They were going to put pressure on Trudeau. They were going to get rid of it. He didn't really talk about the truckers themselves, because I think even Kenney realized that the truckers were just as upset with all vaccine mandates, most of which are at the provincial level. And so you saw the Conservative premiers take a very different approach than Conservative federally, because there's a discipline in power. But he did say, you know, what about your own vaccine mandates? And he said, yeah, by March, you know, maybe March 17th, we'll get rid of those. Yesterday, after the Coutts protests had started on Saturday, so yesterday he goes, yeah, maybe by the end of February, we'll be dropping these restrictions. Today, in a video statement, he said it's going to be within days. That tells me that the protests worked. They were able to change government policy, and they were able to do it through sympathetic government members of caucus and a very wounded Jason Kenney. You know, that is worrisome from a rule of law perspective, that you're allowing a lawless mob to change government policy. And is that going to be the response? We haven't seen the same sort of action. There may be protests, but the shutting down of highways hasn't occurred outside of Coutts and Ottawa. But are we going to see that occur elsewhere? There's now the argument that they need to shut down downtown Toronto.
So Duane, what happens if we have a sixth wave? There's another variant of concern that comes along that succeeds Omicron, maybe in February or March or something. Then what does Kenney do? What do other premiers do if they're worried about the same kind of, you know,
if the whole issue was about, I mean, our hospitalization rates remain high in this province. Another 13 people died today, over 100 in the past week. ICUs are not nearly as bad as they were in September, but they're still up there. And the people in hospital are higher than any time throughout the pandemic. So I don't know what the government does, because they have handed off public policy decisions around COVID to a lawless group, you know, negotiating on how to access this. And what happens if in a couple of days it doesn't change, that hospitalizations remain up? Kenney faces pressure from his own cabinet, from Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Officer of Health. What if he backs down on the promises he made today? Do we see them coming back and blocking Coutts? Absolutely they will, and they'll be even angrier. And this is just a spark waiting for violent action, and it could occur on any side of this. This is an ugly situation in Ottawa. It's an ugly situation in Coutts. And Coutts may get resolved peacefully, but only because the government essentially surrendered.
Is this a crisis, a political crisis, maybe even a constitutional crisis for Canada? I mean, we talked about Alberta mostly. We've talked about Ottawa in particular. But is there a chance that this could, you know, there's significant support in Saskatchewan and some in Manitoba, some in Ontario?
You know, I don't know. You've got, depending on the polling methodology, it appears that people are less enamored by restrictions now than they have been in the past. And I don't blame the public. It's been 2 years. But do they support the actions that are going on in Ottawa? You know, maybe they do, because it's like, oh, well, they're sending them a message, not understanding the impact that this is having on regular, ordinary people. Are they enamored by what's going on in Coutts? Maybe they are, unless they start to realize the effects of this. And what happens if there is a violent clash? How does opinion shift on that? But I think to understand Kenney's actions, you need to put it in a broader context. He's facing a leadership review in early April. He has been facing challenges from his caucus pretty much throughout the pandemic. He is facing low approval numbers. He's realized that the protests weren't just about Justin Trudeau. He was supportive of the protests when it was about Trudeau. Now he's realized it's actually about him. And if the trigger was the vaccine mandate for truckers crossing the border, why would removing provincial restrictions that have nothing to do with the border diminish the protest? Right? So I've got a lot of questions and only some answers.
Well, I think I can say that is true of most Canadians, and we'll be watching the next day or two with bated breath. Thank you very much for this, Duane. Always appreciate your insights.
Okay, thanks, Markham.